Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claire. I'm a wildlife and bird artist and art instructor. I create realistic drawings and paintings of wildlife and birds from across the world. In this video, I want to share with you my latest colour pencil drawing of this beautiful, mighty and elegant osprey. I love drawing birds of prey. They are one of my favourite subjects to draw and incredibly rewarding too. And I will give you a glimpse into my process in this video. But before we get started, if you would like to follow along and draw this exact bird while I chat away to the camera, you can find the full 8.5-hour tutorial class over on my Patreon channel. For those of you who are unaware of my Patreon channel, I provide access to my full catalogue of full-length drawing tutorials. There are currently over 60 on there, with new ones added every month. All my tutorials are wildlife or bird related. I generally specialise in birds, so there are lots of bird tutorials to be found on my Patreon channel. You can gain access to the full line drawing. I like to keep my line drawings as simple as possible, nothing too complicated unless it needs to be, with only the key shapes in place to guide you on getting started with your drawing. And you can also find the materials list as well. Something my students also find really helpful is that I always have the current pencil displayed on the screen. I talk you through the entire process step by step, where you can learn new techniques and tips for creating realistic colour pencil drawings. All videos are in real time and nothing is sped up or missed out. So that's my Patreon channel, which is available right now, and there is a link to that in the description box. So without further ado, let's get started on this beautiful osprey. So I usually start with the eyes and the main facial features. To me, the eye is always the most important part of any piece of artwork because it's where the character of the animal lies. The expression in the eye also plays a really crucial role in defining the character of the bird. I always feel that if the eye isn't right, then the rest of the drawing won't feel right either. So I always make sure that I've got the eye in place first, just to give me that initial confidence to carry on with the rest of the drawing. So I started off by defining the key shapes of the eye, drawing in the outline with a black pencil, and then go in to fill in the colour using a mixture of terracotta and a light yellow ochre to bring out that coloured part of the eye. So you can see from this drawing, compared to the size of my hands, that the drawing is really quite small, and that means it's really important that we keep some really sharp points on our pencils. I use a swordfish pencil sharpener, which I highly recommend to really bring in those sharp points. It really does make a difference to working on something so small. So now I'm going in with the next key feature, which is the beak, and this again is another important area where we need to maintain a nice sharp point. There are lots of small shapes and nooks and crannies within the beak, so I'm going to highlight the edges of those with the black pencil using a mixture of pressures. You can see here on the top of the beak I'm adding the indanthrene blue, which is a reflection on top of the beak to bring about that shininess of the beak and what it's reflecting, which is basically the water, the surrounding water which the bird is flying over. So I needed to get that reflection in place there. So now that the key features are in place, we can start to work on the feathers surrounding the eye and the beak. So here I'm using a medium pressure layer of dark sepia just to block out all of the key shapes and the key shadows that surround the eye. I really wanted to make sure to amplify the intense gaze of the osprey, which means having that deep inset around the edge of the eye. So it's important that I use a slightly firm pressure there and really darkened that shadow, which is going to intensify the gaze. So here I'm just blocking out all of those key shapes within the feathers of the head, just marking out all of the shapes and shadows where they changed. So this is going to act as a guide for us so that we can start to build upon those with further layers and start to intensify the colour. So I'm using a mixture of pressures and using the bluntness of the pencil as well to roughly block in those dark shapes. On top of the head, I wanted to maintain that light and the subtle reflection of the water as well. So I'm using a light grey and also a light ultramarine blue as well. So here I'm starting to work on the chin and chest feathers, which is another important part of the drawing because it helps to define the shape of the bird. I'm starting by blocking in a light pressure layer of the cold grey one and then a light layer of the ultramarine just to bring about a subtle blue reflection. I'm once again defining the key shapes of those feathers using a light pressure layer of the dark sepia. This will then act as a guide to the placement of those feathers so that we can then apply further layers. So once we've got the actual structure in place, it does make it so much easier when we start to add layers of colour. So here I'm starting to add further colour and intensifying the values. I'm adding more blue to make that blue a little richer, and I'm also darkening some of the shadows where I want some of those shadows to appear really dark. And then I'm finishing off this segment with a firm pressure of cold grey one. This helps to smooth out the general pencil texture as well as start to bring in some of the smoothness of those feathers. So now moving on to the back of the neck, this is a crucial part of those feathers because it defines where the head starts and where the shoulder feathers begin. So here I'm just laying down the general direction of those feathers by outlining the edge in a dark sepia pencil before going in with a layer of Van Dyke brown. I'm also using a light pressure to begin with just to get a coverage of colour over the paper. Then we can start to build on those values, and I'm going in with a fairly heavy pressure of dark sepia to outline all of the key shadows that lie within those feathers. You can see here that my pressure is firm enough in the center of the feathers so that the lighter outline of the feathers is actually the lighter base layer showing through. I'm then using that light outline as a guide to the placement of my electric eraser, which is my super handy tool that I love to use in a lot of my work. Here I'm emphasizing those lighter edges, just pulling out a little bit more of the pigment. Moving on to the far wing, which is the inside of the wing, and also this wing is in shadow in contrast to the main wing in front of us. So I wanted to draw with more emphasis of darker midtones and less emphasis on details. And I almost applied the colours in a blocky sort of fashion as well. So I'm going in quite heavy here with a firm pressure of dark sepia just to block in those really dark colours. So then I started to apply the midtones because the light feathers are in shadow and I wanted to make sure that those light tones were dark enough and to give the impression that they are in shadow. So I used quite a firm pressure of warm grey 3. I also wanted to add a contrast of warm tones in the main wing with cool tones on the edge of the wing. So I applied a light layer of yellow ochre over the light shapes and blue tones for the subtle reflection on the edge of the wing. After a little tidying up, I moved on to the tips of the wing feathers using a sharp pencil to outline those key dark shapes, again being quite blocky with the application of colour and avoiding applying too much detail. Because the Osprey has a complex structure with many feathers, I decided to break down the rest of the bird into manageable segments and tackle them one by one. So here is a general rundown of my process in drawing this osprey. Starting with the osprey's back, I blocked in the outline of the main shapes and then applied a base layer. So as far as the base layer is concerned, I used indanthrene blue and dark indigo for the reflective blue feathers and Van Dyke brown and dark sepia for the warmer brown tones. As far as the cool blue tones are concerned, the indanthrene blue is quite a highly pigmented pencil, so I use this sparingly with a light pressure just to avoid the blue being a little too saturated and bright. So establishing this initial base layer with the key shapes outlined provides a solid foundation for the structure of the feathers. It creates a building block to follow along to, and this is the general approach I have taken for the rest of the osprey as well. Next, using a mixture of pressures, I then built up further dark values with a firmer pressure of the Van Dyke brown and a little black to emphasize the darker shadows in each feather, finishing off with a general lighter layer of Van Dyke brown to smooth out the pigment and saturate those brown tones so they appear a little richer. Next, moving on to the main star of the show, which is the beautiful wing, I followed a very similar approach to the process I took for the Osprey's back. I started by blocking in all of the key shapes to maintain the structure of the feathers. Then I applied a base layer, building up those brown and blue tones. This next stage involves quite a monotonous process, which is pretty natural and common with most bird of prey drawings due to the abundance of feathers. So I tackled each feather one by one, building up those dark values and always checking the light source to accurately place those shadows. And I increased the pressure slightly for those darker tones and shadows. And the feathers here are quite small, especially in the top corner, so using a sharp pencil was imperative to get into all those nooks and crannies. Although I did generally soften the general focus in the back corner by eliminating some detail, I still wanted to aim to provide an emphasis of detail without adding any explicit detail itself. As you can see here, to mark out those light tips on each feather, I drew around them, leaving the base layer intact for the tips. I then used an electric eraser to emphasize those tips a little brighter, ensuring that they remained visible when I added further layers. So from this point, I continued building up layers, enhancing the browns and the blue tones, and then adding more shadowing. I also introduced a little bit of black with a sharp pencil to achieve the darkest of those dark shadows. So just like before, I started with the feather outlines and a basic base layer. This time I began towards the bottom where the blue tone feathers are, blocking in the darkest blue shadows first. Next, I moved on to the brown toned feathers, and since these feathers have a subtle pattern, I used a slightly blunted pencil to avoid any sharp edges, while roughly blocking their placement out with a light pressure. I then continued marking out the dark shadows and tones, emphasizing the edges of each feather to maintain their placement and structure. So once you draw in these tones, it's easy for us to work on the feathers further because the structure is now in place. So after this point, I then started to saturate the brown tones further with more Van Dyke brown, and I also added a little black to the dark shadows where the sunlight was casting between each feather. I then finished off by tidying up the edges of each feather with my electric eraser, making those light edges pop. And then I went one stage further by using a nice sharp white museum aquarelle pencil over those light edges. So the museum aquarelle pencil is one of my favourite pencils to use. Not only is it useful for emphasising those erased marks and helping highlights pop even further, but it's also great as a softening tool as well. So it's helping those tips to feel part of the drawing rather than erased. So now we're on to the final row of feathers for this wing, and this process is pretty much the same as the last two rows of feathers, so I'm not going to repeat myself too much here. Instead, I'd just like to share a little bit about my colour choices. So for this drawing, I decided to keep the colour palette fairly simple and straightforward. There aren't many colours in use at all. In fact, I only use one brown tone, which is the Van Dyke brown. So not only do I want this tutorial to be suitable for all skill levels, but I also wanted to show that it is possible to create a realistic drawing with just a few colours. So for these white tone feathers, I started by leaving the white of the paper and drawing some brown tones around them. But remember that white tones are never purely white, so I used a warm grey pencil to add some warmth to the shadows of the white feathers. I also made sure to emphasise the shadows next to the white areas to make them stand out more. And then following with a layer of the white museum aquarelle pencil, which you'll see me do in a little while, just to add a little bit of vibrancy and softness to those white tones. And then for the ends of these feathers, I'm just glazing over with a layer of light ultramarine just to add a general blue tone to the tips of the feathers and give the impression of that reflection. So in order to bring everything together of what I've drawn so far, this final stage involves polishing off the drawing and tidying up everything that we've drawn so far. So this is just tying everything together. I call it the tidying up stage. And this is where you'll see me use a white pencil, not just for smoothing out the texture of the pencil, but also for lightening up some of those soft reflections on the feathers, just to give them a subtle soft highlight. So I'm not using this too much. It's a light pressure on just the odd feather here and there, just for a really soft, subtle texture. And also, as part of the tidying up process, this also involves going over everything I've drawn using a blending pencil. In this case, I'm using a Derwent blender, but I also recommend the Rembrandt's Lyris blender as well. Both are great blending pencils. I tend to use blending pencils quite sparingly. It's not something I like to use until the very end layers to give the drawing that final polish. So basically I go over everything I've drawn so far to soften the overall pigment. Colour pencil can have quite a grainy appearance, and it's one of my personal preferences to eliminate a good chunk of that graininess. This also helps with the smooth feathered appearance of the birds that I draw, so it contributes to the realism as well. So when using the blending pencil, I don't press too firmly either, as it can lighten the overall tone. A soft pressure is all that is needed, followed by a darker pencil, just to touch up any edges and keep those lines nice and crisp. The final feathers to tackle are the all-important tail feathers, and in the full tutorial on Patreon, I discuss a methodical approach to these feathers to help us keep track of those square type shapes. It's important to stay organised when drawing birds of prey, especially when faced with something that seems overwhelming at first glance. I really wanted to help my students avoid feeling a little bit disorientated by these shapes, so I demonstrate in the actual tutorial how to break this down into easy steps and stay completely on track. So the final part of this drawing is the feet. Admittedly a pet hate of mine. Definitely not my favourite part to draw, but an all-important aspect too. So when it comes to drawing bird feet, I like to soften my focus on the reference photo, just a soft squint to get a general feel for the placement of key shapes and colours, and I then plot those out on my drawing and refine them. So these bird feet had quite a few different colours and tones, which is quite interesting as far as bird feet go, and that's not something I normally say. And for the feet as well, I know I sound like a broken record, but this is one of the most important areas, along with the eyes, to maintain a sharp pencil. If you do want to follow along with this tutorial, please make sure that you have a decent pencil sharpener. I promise it will make your life much easier. The last thing I want for you to do is spoil a beautiful drawing with a blunt pencil on those talons. And let's face it, an osprey has long but sharp talons, so we need to make sure that we have our pencils nice and sharp. So that's pretty much it for this video. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to follow along with the full 8.5-hour tutorial, you can find the entire class on Patreon. There I walk you through the whole piece step by step, all in real time. I really hope you enjoyed this video and that you picked up a few tips and lessons from this condensed version. Let me know what you think in the comments, and feel free to share what other subjects you'd like to see. I love drawing all kinds of wildlife, although I do have a special soft spot for birds, so your ideas and recommendations are always welcome. Thank you so much for watching, take care and see you next time.